Chapter 16, The Creek Farm, 870s, Junker de Carr slang for a worthless thing. The old cabin was a junker. The farmstead that Alec and Jenny had started together had limitations. The fields were small and mostly steep. Plowing and planting on the thin hillside soil caused it to erode and become less productive each successive year. In order to have more fertility, new ground had to be cleared and plowed to find richer soil for most things to grow. With little organic supplements available, the ground seemed to wear out and yield less and less. The steeper ground required a special plow that could make the furrow flop downhill to help it not erode when the heavy rains came. But the practices of plowing made for short-lived clearings and would one day return to forest. A log cabin was never intended to be a permanent dwelling. It was a fast and cheap way to get shelter, but the wood roof and walls gave way to rot and insects that slowly weakened the structure. Jenny's cabin would need some fixing if she was to stay in her hollow. The rocks used to build up its pillar corners, and the chimney would remain for generations to come. Remains of rock fences can still be found beneath the canopy of reforested trees. Jenny had a decision to make about her holler homestead, and the growing boys helped her to decide to move. The ravages of war and marauding terrorists made many folks abandon their homesteads during and after the Civil War. What land that was sold went cheap. There was virtually no money to buy anything of value, and bartering was the common currency of the locals. The state of Arkansas discontinued the collection of taxes in Searcy County during the war. Since there was no sheriff to collect taxes, and the courthouse burned to the ground, records were lost, and many had no money to pay taxes. Ownership and protection of property was up to the individual, and a verbal agreement was considered a legal transaction. Being a widow and having essentially no money, how was Jenny able to have several acres of creek bottom land? The answer must be that at the time, so many had left the area that much of the farmland was cheap or even free to the first person to move onto the property. Those fleeing the Ozark Hills made it possible for those who remained to get a bargain. Jenny's holler farm was worth little to nothing, and she probably just let it go back to the wild or to the next person who paid on it when the collection of taxes began again. Jenny acquired a farm a couple of miles down Bear Creek at a confluence of Lick Fork at an unknown date. Below the juncture, a bottom field opened, creating a few acres of creek bottom. Bear Creek curved east, and the creek bottom crossed to the other side. Where the bottom land began on the far side of the creek was a smaller portion of the land Jenny had acquired. Near where the creek made its turn was an old homestead. Jenny's grandson, Perry Harness, recalls when he lived on Bear Creek that the field that his father Riley called Sand Land had a house foundation and some old pear trees. It was probably the house that Jenny, Mart, and Billy first lived in when they moved to the creek farm. Much like her cabin she had left in Jenny Harness Hollow, the creek house would need some fixing up. Her young boys had become old enough to help with chores, and each year they took on more work to help their mother be a successful farmer. The creek bottom land was much easier to work, and the deeper soil made it possible to grow crops more successfully. A cabin made of logs could be patched with new wood. As nails became more available and affordable, it was possible to slap a split board over a hole and hold it with a nail. Nails also replaced pegs for hooks to hang things on the wood walls. The term "nailed it" surely got its start from the result of securing a solution for the problem with a nail. In areas of the southern states where the land was poor, the landowners were yeoman farmers. The term identified those who were subsistence farmers, but some managed to grow cash crops for market or bartering. They were smaller farmers than the planter who had slaves. The idea of yeoman farming advocated independent family farmers who typically farmed less than 200 acres. After the Civil War, 1861-1865, some independent farmers and organized groups like the Grange and Farmers Alliance helped them to gain access to profitable markets. Those groups helped make America a great producer of food and also influenced projects that aided the farmer. Construction of the Transcontinental Railroad, 1863-1869, connecting the East and West, was the work of President Lincoln to help finance and build, but the farm groups supported the effort. Jenny was a yeoman farmer by definition, though I don't know that she ever joined any farm organization. My guess is that the Ole hen did all the scratching of dirt with her 2 poults and looked nowhere else for help. She would never have a rooster to distract her. During years with good and favorable weather, she could produce enough to sell some. The agricultural economy of Searcy County would diversify with time. Transportation routes improved so that produce from the hills was more accessible to markets and growth of urban areas which wanted the food and goods they could buy from yeoman farmers. Shortly before the war ended, a novel experiment reminiscent of early pioneer days had begun in the war-ravaged counties of northwest Arkansas. Colonel M. LaRue Harrison, a Union commander, began to organize farmers in agricultural communities called post colonies for the protection against bushwhackers. As home guards, the men in selected communities were armed and organized to cultivate and pasture abandoned land. Rebuilding houses and barns, the communities contained 50 to 100 inhabitants. One of the post colonies was on Richland Creek in Searcy County. The war ended before the colonies had a fair chance at proving their worth, and they dissolved. The bushwhackers became bolder and more lawless as the colonies dwindled. The violence became greater, causing many people to flee the hills, making those who stayed more isolated and vulnerable. Those, like Jenny, who stayed, wanted to be left alone, but the dirty business of those ruthless dogs took away what little peace afforded them and made dark clouds of worry over their heads. Men and boys were at risk of being murdered, and this compounded the shortage of males who might marry or help women who were trying to survive. In 1867, an increasing number of Southerners turned to violence toward the changes that were imposed on them. One organization was the Ku Klux Klan. It became a threat to freed blacks and any who supported the Republican leaders who had given the Negro freedom and rights. Racism against blacks and others who were not white would not change for decades in the South. The Klan came to Arkansas in the spring of 1868, just a month after black Americans voted in the election for the first time. Most of the white Southerners in the state were not allowed to vote or hold office, being Democrats. A Republican governor and a Republican legislature occupied the newly formed government of Reconstruction. Those conditions in the state made it ripe for mostly Democrats to join forces, and the KKK gained traction quickly among so many disgruntled men. Both Negro and Republicans were randomly attacked, and some were killed. The violence made by the Klan led to their unpopular role and reputation. They became secretive and only public when unrest occurred. when blame could be charged against Negro, Jew, or Oriental people. A legacy of bitterness existed in the South inside and outside of groups that wanted to blame and target perceived opponents. The hills of North Arkansas had remained a frontier, and the war prolonged its development. The highlands were mostly farmers engaged in subsistence farming. Access to the area was limited, and no well-developed roads or rails had been built. It was backwoods to those in more populated areas. Horses had replaced many oxen, but it was a land of mostly trails and rutted roads. If the creek was up, you might get wet trying to cross it and hope you could stay mounted lest the current takes you under. City folks who came to the area saw a contrast between city and country that would only slightly improve over several decades. The war had caused local government to cease operations. Judges, sheriffs, and recorders fled or failed to carry out their duties. Taxes went uncollected, and jails were emptied. Lawsuits and complaints went unanswered as courts closed. Attorneys, doctors, and businessmen fled to places where they could practice, or they quit to join the war. Anarchy became the rule, and besides the bushwhackers, lawless and immoral men with no affiliation to any group made life difficult and dangerous for many citizens. Arkansas was not readmitted into the Union until 1868. So many things seemed to only add insult to injury in those years following the war. Far removed from the people in the Ozarks, the U.S. government agreed with the Russian Empire in 1867 to buy the land of Alaska for the cost of $7.2 million. Some called the deal made by U.S. Secretary of State William Seward Seward's Folly or Seward's Icebox. The mostly uninhabited lands remained unexplored and undeveloped until 1880, when gold was discovered and a rush ensued by thousands of fortune seekers. Much like the rush of 1849 in California, men stayed and began to populate the land. Mining in Searcy County did not happen yet for half a century when zinc ore was found. Reflection. For Jenny and her fellow citizens of Searcy County, Reconstruction was primarily them rebuilding what others had destroyed or neglected. As the American colonists had to rebuild after the War for Independence, it was Southerners who then had to do much the same. Without financial assistance, Jenny worked with her 2 hands and 2 feet and with her boys to make small progress. Survival was her most important feat, and that continued well, but was always at risk. No bank loan, no credit, little money, but rich faith in God. In famine he shall redeem you from death, and in war from the power of the sword. Job 5:20. End note. Before the Civil War, the area at Snowball and nearby was more settled and prosperous than any in the county. After the war, it continued to attract newcomers and businesses. The Richland Valley had some of the best creek bottom land anywhere. During the war, this report was made of some of the places and people living there. I noticed that the Union Army supply wagon trail used mules, of which 100 were killed. This points to mules being used as the Missouri mule's introduction of a fine breed. It also points to the lack of appreciation for mules by the Confederates who witlessly killed them. In December 1863, the 1st Arkansas Cavalry, under Captain John the Sir Worthington, marched from Fayetteville to reconnoiter Carroll, Marion, and Searcy counties. The Federals skirmished almost continuously along Richland Creek with independent Confederate troops under a Major Gunning and a Colonel Freeman. culminating in a major firefight on New Year's Eve that ended in a draw. During the fight, Merritt Cash's house was used as a Confederate hospital. The Confederates reported 25 dead and 33 wounded, while the Federals lost 6 men, with less than 10 reported wounded. As the fighting ended, the rebels fell back to Clapper's Mill in Carroll County, while the 1st Arkansas returned to Fayetteville via Newton County. In May 1864, a bushwhacker ambush on a Union forage train near Point Peter Mountain left 39 Union dead, the wagon train in flames, and more than 100 mules killed